Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Hope you're having a wonderful evening. Appreciate everyone that joins me here on this live. I got a couple of really interesting topics to go over. One is Dennis Quaid. So he's been in the news a lot recently around the movie Reagan that he's come out with. He's in a new film, and we're going to cover some topics some things he had to say about Hollywood, kind of exposing it for what it is, how it's different when he was getting into filmmaking, movie making, acting. And so we're going to cover some of the comments he said on the Joe Rogan podcast. We're also going to be taking a look at some comments that Jonathan Roumie from The Chosen, who plays Jesus, had to say about the hate and the criticism that the show gets, especially from Christians who think it's wrong to do a show like this. So we're going to take a look at that. Also, we might get a little bit into something, a little surprise bonus topic at the very end. So hope you stick with me. Hope you enjoy the stream. And if you're here and you want to hang out, interact with me in the chat, I'd love to talk to you live here this evening. So with that, I'll jump right into the Dennis Quaid bit. So Dennis Quaid has recently been on a tour for his Reagan film, and he's been on many different podcasts, different shows promoting it. And if you haven't seen the trailer, it's actually pretty interesting. But he recently, a few weeks ago, went on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he talked a little bit. We talked a lot, talked about politics. It's a movie about Ronald Reagan, and so it brings up politics. And in today's world, it's very heavily talked about. But if you haven't seen the trailer, I'll just play you a quick snippet. You should definitely check it out because it looks pretty interesting. But check out this little snippet from the trailer.
I will be frank with you that as a citizen, I would not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its ideology, because I still believe, Mr. Chairman, that democracy can handle it.
Very interesting. I haven't got a chance to see the movie yet, but it, according to Rotten Tomatoes, critics don't care for it, but the audience loves it. So yeah, but he recently went on Joe Rogan's podcast and talked a little bit about Hollywood, and he kind of shares an interesting perspective on where Hollywood is today, as well as where it was like in the 70s. So I'm going to go through this. I'm going to react to it and break it down. So let's go ahead and get into this.
70s in Hollywood must have been a weird experience, man.
Oh, it's fantastic. It was amazing, man. That whole era of the 70s, which started with Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider.
Great films.
Yeah,
Great
but
films
it was the French New Wave, is what they called it, kind of more handheld, grittier. And it was the return of the anti-hero and the rebel hero. And because Hollywood had lost touch with their audience, they were making movies like Toby Tyler and, these bloated musicals.
Right. That's an interesting point about losing touch, even back in the day, because they were doing these bloated musicals, like literally like The Sound of Music, or, all of these dancing, like the old movies, especially when black and white first started coming out, or when black and white was fizzling out and color was coming into Hollywood. There was this boom of musicals and these big sets, big Broadway style movies, and they were so long. I mean, like Sound of Music, how long is that movie? Like 3.5 hours long. The King and I, you guys remember that one? Super long movies. But yeah, it's like Hollywood was making a shift in the 70s to more of like the Spielberg kind of vibe, more of kind of like there was like a rebellion almost inside of Hollywood on the type of movies Hollywood makes. And he gets into that.
So it became like the inmates had taken over the asylum. There was really new, exciting stuff getting done, like, Badlands and The Conversation, and, which led to The Godfather. And that was
right. Godfather. Like all of these movies were kind of like the new era of filmmaking, and it really was the 70s that kind of like shifted it. Probably the end of the 60s, midway through the 60s, and then the 70s, really it was like solidified, where there was actually established creators in Hollywood that their movies were getting funded and they weren't traditional Hollywood films.
I think the golden age of filmmaking.
Well, certainly some amazing films came out.
The golden age of filmmaking, maybe back in the 70s. I know there's a tendency to always look back and glorify the past, but I think he's actually might be right about this, because although there is really awesome creators today like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve that's creating some incredible films, it's just not, it's very enjoyable today, don't get me wrong, but it's just not as revolutionary, and there's not that wow factor like there would have been back in the 70s, where it feels like whole new genres are coming to light.
Out of that era. It's just seeing Los Angeles today and imagining what it was like in the 70s. It had to be, because I mean, really, movies, if you really think about it, they were only a few decades old back then.
Yeah.
It's a new thing, essentially. You know?
They just like perfected it. I mean, really, it was only like 10 years into where all the movies were color. They were making black and white movies up to like 63, you know?
Right. Like,
Oh, that's true. I didn't even think about that. Obviously, I wasn't there, not old enough to have been there, but that is an interesting point, that even in the 70s, where there was this like big revolution when it comes to filmmaking and the type of movies that were being made, yeah, they were just fresh into color film. They were still doing a whole bunch of black and white stuff. That's crazy.
The Hustler was black and white.
Yeah.
That was 63.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was an exciting time. Like I said, the inmates had taken over the asylum, and it was a feeling like you could do just about anything. And music, too, was really happening in Los Angeles as well. I mean, record deals were getting signed left and right. And there was this, it's kind of turned upside down now.
Right. So he's basically setting up where Hollywood was in the 70s and where they're kind of riding through like the 80s, and we were getting new stuff and we were building that momentum, and then something happened, right?
All that rebellious attitude of the 70s, and everybody, it sort of became the establishment, I think.
Yeah. Bizarre, right?
It's really kind of turned up on its ear, because it started to kind of really turn politically correct in the 90s. And it became kind of a, nobody stays at a party after 11 o'clock. No matter
Is that when you went into rehab?
After that, no matter where you're going, afterwards you got to pretend you were going to bed.
That's interesting that he said the ones who were the rebellious type became the establishment. I guess that just has to do with like the success of their shows. They started getting invited and maybe becoming kind of like the leaders and they were no longer the young creatives. They were like becoming the leaders of what Hollywood was going to become. And they kind of like lost that break away from the mold mentality and kind of became conformists on some level. That's what it seems like. That's what it sounds like he's getting into. And then in like the 90s, it started becoming like this politically correct thing, right? And that might have been the tipping point to where we are today. But let's see what else he has to say.
Oh, look at the time.
Yeah, look at the I guess everybody had kids too by that point. But then it got to where we are today, that you're getting warned to keep your mouth shut because of it turned upside down.
Well, it's also.
That's crazy. He keeps saying it got turned upside down. So it's like obviously someone who was around the culture of Hollywood and entertainment from the 70s is like looking at it today and being like, it's completely upside down. It's completely got turned around. And it's like literal warnings to keep your mouth shut in regards to, I'm guessing, politics. It seems like that's what they're talking about, is the political nature of Hollywood and how it's so incredibly progressive, but that there's no room for alternative thought there, or thought that's different from what it wants to be. Like you have to be a conformist, and you get basically threats with your job if you decide to go against that, right?
One ideology dominates, especially in Hollywood, dominates the entire business. One of the things I said that drove me crazy about Hollywood was there's people that had differing opinions about things, but they would never speak out because it could damage their career.
Right.
And it really can. Now. They will fucking blackball you.
They will. I mean, they tried, there were a couple of attempts to cancel me while we were making Reagan, in fact.
There were attempts to cancel him while he was making Reagan? While they were making Reagan, that's crazy. It's like literally, I don't know if it's because he was like outspoken during the process in Hollywood, or if it was literally just the nature of the film that they were making that maybe it was very pro-America. It didn't really fit the mold with what the agendas were today coming out of Hollywood. And it's more of like that rebellious spirit kind of filmmaking he was talking about from the 70s, but that's not really smiled upon out of Hollywood right now because they're very big business. And so, yeah, cancellation is not so much like, yeah, they want to ruin your reputation, but really it's just for the purposes of shutting you up because they don't want any voices outside of the narrative they're trying to paint to be able to speak into the entertainment industry.
Kind of half-hearted, I guess. But it has become that, and that ain't right. I mean, back then, few people really were, I guess, conservative. Let's throw out parties and just call it conservative. I mean, you had John Wayne.
John Voight.
Yeah. But you didn't know if John Voight was conservative back then.
He wasn't vocal about it?
Not back in the 70s, no. But it was basically John Wayne and Charlton Heston.
Right.
And that,
Charlton Heston and John Wayne were the only conservatives in Hollywood. They were the only ones out there being like, we're huge entertainers. Like we are like the faces of old Hollywood. And they're like super conservative. Maybe that's why they're in so many movies, because they were like the only ones with alternative thought or something. Like they were a smaller pool to pull out of, I guess. I don't know.
That's pretty much about it. Or anybody wearing a tie.
Well, how did the rebels become, like, what the fuck happened? How did the rebels become the establishment?
We went through an era where remember, it was tolerance. That was what we were trying to do, like back in the teens, I think, in the teens, we tolerate other groups and all that. And that didn't last very long. And it seems like one had it over the other. But if you add,
that's interesting that he says that the tolerance didn't last very long. Because maybe he was talking about, like, obviously, like with social justice in the 2000s and the 2000 teens, that they were bringing in that in a big way into Hollywood. But he said it didn't last very long. That's interesting to hear that perspective of what he means. And I would like to have heard them dig into that more, because that is an interesting perspective that I think he uniquely has, because he's seen so many eras of Hollywood, right?
Asking me where this great divide really started politically, I think, of course, there was Watergate, but you come up to like when the Republicans had their contract with America. I think it was like 94, the year that Clinton was going to be a lame duck president. They had those midterms. And then it started to become just along party lines where there was no, you were a traitor if you went to the other side, or because we had conservative Democrats, we had liberal Republicans up until that point. That's what I grew up with. And
party lines, like, it's interesting that it all kind of boils down to politics. Like it's almost like politics kind of becomes, I don't know, Hollywood's God in some capacity, because it's like, or it's like a cult of politics in some way. Like it's devolved into that. It's not really an industry of creatives trying to do new, interesting things. It really seems like it's just become a cult of political opinions, and not like a diverse opinions, like one opinion, right? And it's apparently Dennis Quaid doesn't really feel like he fits that mold, probably because he's like old Hollywood. And they've tried to cancel him, like new Hollywood, modern Hollywood's tried to cancel him a few times, as he said, in just making this new Reagan movie. Let's see if he has anything else to say that's interesting.
That wasn't good enough anymore. And so he started there, and and then continued, and then the Democrats really took over, and they really do it really well as far as that stuff of turning things on their head. And they're, I feel like today they were using the judicial system.
Yeah, so then they get a little bit into actual politics with the current election. But that's interesting that he says, and the Democrats do it really well of turning things on their head. And so I think it's definitely an evolving process with Hollywood. There's this weird balance, right, that I think Hollywood has to make when it comes to their political agendas being pushed at the audiences and what they want their Hollywood system to be messaging and about, and that everyone that's in the system doesn't stray from it. But at the same time, they have to balance with what the audience wants, because the audience is what makes them money. The industry doesn't stay afloat unless, like, the American people, but also the world, doesn't watch their stuff, right? So there's this weird balance where the market can correct Hollywood at some point, and we do see it happening year over year recently, where the market can dictate the future of Hollywood, but it's like this internal war where they want to dictate their own future and what their own value system is. And if they even have values, it's hard to tell. I'm sure there are some, but not many. And then what the public wants to be entertained by. So I think that I mean, in my opinion, it's coming to a head. Something's going to break. Either, Hollywood's going to give and be like, okay, we're just going to create films only that just please the audience. And we're going to stop trying to, I guess, insert our own thoughts and opinions about what the audience wants or what we want them to hear. And it's going to become, something that we've seen like in the early 2000s, in the late 90s, probably, because I don't think it's never going to become a conservative environment, but it could pull back and it could break that way, or it could just completely demolish. And the majority of audiences, or at least a large chunk of the audiences, just refuse to watch movies that are coming out of like the big Hollywood system. And it turns into kind of like an indie market for entertainment. It's definitely coming to a place where there has to be a breaking point that results in change. I don't think we can continue going down this road and it just move with the same momentum that it has been. I think there's definitely going to be a change, and we'll see which direction it goes. But obviously, even legacy actors like Dennis Quaid can see the truth about it, having seen the whole thing and the years and decades with his own eyes, and he has this opinion that it's completely turned on its head, right? 70s golden age of filmmaking. Today it's completely backwards and turned on its head, and I think it's pretty obvious that he's not a big fan of it. Let me know in the chat if you guys are here. We're going to go on to Jonathan Roumie here in a minute and hear what he had to say about The Chosen. And the criticism that they're getting. But let me know in the chat if you're here. Any thoughts you have around Hollywood, Dennis Quaid. I'll try to address them. Yeah, this is kind of crazy. I really enjoy the fact that online there is a consistent, diverse opinion base, right? When it comes to ideas. And that although there is, some censoring that goes on, I like that in the world of entertainment and media, that places like YouTube and Rumble and X and I guess Twitter Twitter is X, but Twitter didn't used to be this way. I think that I like the discourse. I like the fact that, people like Theo Vaughn will interview Bernie Sanders one week and Donald Trump the next, right? I like the fact that Joe Rogan has on Dennis Quaid and, Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr., right? And I think it creates a diverse opinion base, and we can actually hear people out. And I think that's the best way for entertainment, obviously politically, but also just human relations, right? Like it's so important that we have that. And I love that we're in a place that it still feels very much like the real conversations are happening on the internet, and true discourse that's productive is happening on the internet. A lot of people like to say the internet's full of trolls and stuff, and I just don't think that's true. I think there's more solid-minded people online, and even in YouTube comments and on X. I think there are more people that care about the future and care about genuine interaction with their fellow human that's productive and builds us into a better future than, a lot of people give the internet credit for. So let me know what you guys think. All right. We're going to move on to Jonathan Roumie. And so some interesting new developments. So Jonathan Roumie went on the podcast Pints with Aquinas, and he had a few things to say in the middle of the podcast about the criticism that The Chosen show receives. All right. And it's kind of an interesting take. There's like a lot of attempts that I've heard, like Dallas Jenkins, the creator of the Chosen show, give in regards to the backlash that the show receives. And so this is actually, I think, the first time Jonathan Roumie, at least that I know of, has addressed, right, this issue of a certain group of believers, maybe some unbelievers, are very critical of the Chosen show and how they go about telling a story of the life of the followers of Jesus, and Jesus being a character in the show. So let's start, and we'll go through this, react to it, break it down. Let's get into this.
First time I heard about The Chosen, I was upstairs doing something, and we have a TV in our basement, and I think one of the kids came up and said, "We're watching this new show about Jesus, like it's a new series or something."
And you're like,
and
oh,
I think,
no.
yeah, I think my eyes rolled. Yeah, my eyes rolled because we all know the experience
as
of
they should
watching a
have.
religious movie, and you're like, oh dear. I am not just saying this to be nice to you.
Truly, I say to thee.
Yeah, that's so relatable, honestly. Like I've been in part of, not only have I watched Christian films, I've been a part of some of them. And they're, first off, they're usually created by people who don't understand filmmaking. And I've had to observe and be in the middle of just a mess when it comes to a lack of knowledge around filmmaking. But it also always comes out super corny and cheesy. And so, yeah, that's relatable. And that's one thing that I really love about The Chosen show is it's very tolerable and actually enjoyable. And I think that just goes to show with the quality of the writing to make it engaging and telling a good story. Dallas Jenkins, his father, can't remember his first name, but he's the guy who wrote the Left Behind series. His father's like a really famous Christian novelist. So I think Dallas grew up in a household that knew how to tell stories. And so The Chosen is actually an engaging Christian series. Also, it's kind of like one of the only big Christian series. Everything else that's Christian is like movies and whatnot. So let's keep going.
Totally. Yeah. Not just saying this to be nice to you, but when you walked on set as Jesus, it just made sense. It wasn't jarring. It wasn't like, well, this is weird, but I got to get used to it. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And it's way more. It's way more than just your hair and beard, clearly. You know.
It's
So,
also, I mean, that
well
first.
done.
Thank you so much. That first scene is in a bar.
Okay.
And Jesus walks into a bar where Mary Magdalene is drowning her sorrows and on the verge of committing suicide in our story. You know, we take some creative license. It's based on the Gospels.
Yeah, that's actually, I'll be honest, that is the scene that I feel like almost everybody who watched the first episode was sold on the show. If you watched The Chosen season 1 and you made it to the end of episode 1, I was kind of skeptical the whole time. I was like, is this going to be cheesy? Is this worth me investing time in? Do I feel like it's being done well? And when I saw that scene, I was completely hooked. My interest was beyond peaked. I was in, man. I was like, all right, I'm watching the entire season. Let's see how this plays out. The ending of episode 1 in season 1 really does get you. And I don't think it's necessarily Jonathan Roumie, but it has to do with the writing, the storytelling, and then the performance after that, right? And the setup, like he was saying, the setting of the characters. It wasn't trying to paint these biblical characters with like Christian, lens brushes, I guess. It was literally making it gritty. Like there's suicide involved, there's bars involved, there's drunkenness involved, and there's even demon possession involved, right? It is dark. And yeah, I was hooked. After that.
It's not meant to replace the Gospels. It's not meant to, let's just relax in our story. You know, we take some creative license. It's based on the Gospels. It's not meant to replace the Gospels. It's not meant to, let's just relax. Everyone. I was going to ask you about this because there's a lot. We live in such a divisive time. Everything's being pulled apart. Oh, yeah. You know, like the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the conservatives in America, the Catholic Church, the Jewish community. Like it feels like everything's being sifted as wheat. Yeah. And
well, I definitely agree with that. I do think, as I was saying earlier, the internet is a place where this happens, and I think it's a good thing being sifted through. And so I think discourse is actually really good because it allows us to actually, as he said, sift through and create something that's actually good and have a collective opinion that's been well thought out and well debated. However, in fact, I think it brings to light what is good and bad. So, an example, the Rings of Power is just a bad show. The Acolyte is just a bad show. And if we didn't have the internet, you'd probably just be there thinking it by yourself, but there wouldn't be this discourse on it. And so, yeah, it's not really divisive. It sort of is, but if you choose not to engage with the divisiveness and just have an opinion and put your opinion out there in YouTube comments and in YouTube videos, then it creates more to the conversation that is ultimately productive. That's what I say. And so even with The Chosen, I think it's also productive.
It's really like, you're just like, hey, what if we just did this like show where we kind of did a kind of a Lectio Divina on the Gospels? Well, actually, like, there's a lot of that. And of course, that's not to say there can't be legitimate criticisms of artwork.
That's the thing. I don't really care for that take. I'm 100% fine with people being critical of the show. And I'm also, if I think that something's well done, I will defend it to those people in the same way that I'm the guy who's pushing up his glasses, right, when it comes to Rings of Power, because I know I'm a big fan of Tolkien. I know a lot about what's actually correct, and I think it's garbage. So yeah, I think that's actually a good thing. He's framing it as sort of a negative thing, but I differ with him there.
Obviously, we're not saying that, but it's, how have you dealt with that? How's Dallas dealt with that?
He's pretty remarkable in that there's.
If you guys don't know who Dallas is, Dallas Jenkins is the creator of the show, right? He's the guy who writes it, directs it. He's co-producing it. So
not much that sticks with him. He just kind of, bounces off of him, and he's like, yeah, whatever. Like he already knows what it's going to be, what the criticisms will be before we even shoot the scene, I feel like. There are times where I'm like, this is going to get a rise out of people, but I get it. I'm like, this is, and we've had actually discussions about like, okay, well,
that's an interesting idea, is like the automatic nature in your mind of when they're filming something, this is going to get a rise out of people. So when I look at the show, I guess there's been like 1, 2, maybe 3 times where I was like, yeah, this is going to get a rise out of people, or like people aren't going to care for this. But honestly, a lot of the divisive like criticism the show's received, I was surprised by it. I know there was the whole thing in season 3, I believe, where Jesus says, I am the law of Moses, right? And maybe it was season 4. Yeah, I think it was season 3. And that apparently is, a lot of people were saying they're taking it out of the Book of Mormon. That ended up not being true, right? But there's just also like a lot of false narratives. I think people tend to hate on the show, specifically this show, because not because it's not good. It actually is really good. It actually is really engaging because the focus is human, right? The focus is on the human experience, and how would real humans interact with God himself coming to earth and becoming human and steering humanity in the right direction and saying things that no humans ever heard before. That is a very interesting concept, and it's actually very well done. I believe it's very well written. You could disagree there, but I think it's very engaging. I have no problem with it. There's a few small criticisms that I bring up, but there's nothing major. Now, with that, I am surprised by some of the things that people online latch onto. Again, I think that's a good thing, because then we have the ability to counter it if it's actually false or it's actually just kind of a trash opinion, right? I think it kind of boils down to people just don't want a show about Jesus being made at all. I think anything that's putting Jesus on screen being represented by a human, I think that makes people uncomfortable. It makes some people uncomfortable. And so I think there's just some people that just don't want to see any movie, show, or any kind of depiction of Jesus if it involves an actor to play Jesus. I think that's the broad idea of why it receives criticism, is people with that mindset that just get upset about the idea of a show about Jesus, right?
Well, how do we best approach this scene? Because you and I both know that this is going to read one way to some people and another way to other people. And like, how do we just keep this continually universally ecumenical, where we're not planting a flag one place or another? Because that's been, for me, in my observations, that's been the reason for the success of the show. It's because it is so universal. It is so beloved because of how it's not denominationally specific. It's story specific. It's Jesus specific. It's Jesus centric. It's meant to get you to think about the reality of Jesus' life on earth and what he did that was both human and divine in the course of his life and ministry.
That's a really good point. The point of the show is to get you to think about the life of Jesus, his divinity, and what he means for humanity and the world, right? And that's why the focus of the show is on the disciples, is on the followers of Jesus and the people that were around Jesus or interacted with Jesus, whether they are in the Bible or whether they're not in the Bible or really elaborated on in the Bible. Like the one character of Gaius, where he's been in season 1 and he's been observing and around Jesus for multiple seasons. And then in season 4, we get who he is in the Bible. Like they reveal what character he actually is, who does show up in the Bible. But it doesn't say in the Bible that he was around that whole time, right? So they take some creative liberties, but they don't contradict the events that actually happen in the Bible or the intention of the teachings of Jesus. I think that's the big difference. That's my standard when I approach a show or a movie, if there's source material. And when it comes to the Bible, that's some pretty heavy source material, to say it lightly. I would say, does it contradict, and is it used as the foundation of the show to build on? Or are you building your own show and your own story and then inserting established source material in as Easter eggs or in as, member berries or in as like point motivators, but it's not the foundation of what you're building on? The timeline of events for The Chosen is the foundation from the Bible, and they're not contradicting scripture. The point he makes about multi-denominational, they're staying away in the show from claiming a denomination. I know Jonathan Roumie and a couple characters are Catholic. I know that Dallas Jenkins is Protestant. I know they have a couple of Jewish individuals who help with writing the show, and that's why they get into the deep details of Jewish culture in the show. There's a lot of diversity of opinions, but the goal is that they all want to tell a story about Jesus that's respectful. I also believe there are some people working on the show, even as actors, that aren't necessarily Christians. I could be wrong about this. Not all of them have been super upfront about that, but at least in season 1 and season 2, there's already been a couple that have come out and said, like, didn't really have a really strong faith in my life, or I didn't have any faith and I came to faith working on the show. So yeah, it's interesting that when you don't pick a side, it kind of creates unity, huh? When you don't pick a side. But there's some people that feel like they pick sides. There are people still trying to convince everyone that this is a show made by Mormons, when the guys who are writing it, there's no Mormons writing the show, right? It's just, it got its initial funding from Angel Studios, who the company's owned by Mormon guys, but
and get people talking. And hopefully, if you've never met Jesus, if you don't know who Jesus is, if you've never opened the Bible, this is meant to gauge your interest and provoke interest in knowing more about these people, about this movement. We describe the show now as a historical drama, because that's what it is. It's a historical drama about these people at this time, and this man and our God in this movement. If you don't accept that he's God, that's your journey. But we're presenting it as this is what this story is. And if it strikes something beyond just that of a narrative, television show, glory to God. Like that's the I think the end goal for many of us working on the show who are believers, who love Jesus and see him as more than just a person who, roamed the earth for a few years and taught some things and had some maxims that stuck around beyond his lifetime.
That's very interesting. I don't want to just play through a ton of the podcast, but I'm curious, what do you all think? What do you all think of this response to the criticism? I think he handled it with grace. He kind of touched on it and basically solidified his viewpoint and his point behind how he approaches the show, how he approaches the diversity of opinions about the show. And I'm sure he probably would address at the same time the people who glorify him too much and, call him Jesus out in public. I believe there was a whole documentary they made about Jonathan and Jesus that probably addresses that. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think about his response here, addressing the criticism. He's not really saying anything bad about the criticism. All he's saying is that, like, our intention is not to be divisive. Our intention is to tell a dramatized historical show about the people, and that ultimately lead you to ask questions and, you know, like read the Bible, you know what I mean? And get people to think. That's the point of the show, which is like a really honest way of approaching it. And again, when I look at this, I don't really need an explanation because I can watch the show. I could see what they're doing, and I'm okay with it because I respect the amount of effort they're putting into staying true to the events that happen in the Bible without deleting stuff, without changing or twisting what the Bible or Jesus's teachings intended to try to motivate an interesting story that they want to tell. No, it's solid, right? And yes, they add some details into that are plausible and probable, but do not contradict anything that the Bible actually teaches. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about all of that, because I think it's very interesting. I think it's very interesting to hear his opinions around the criticism. Also, let me know in the comments, have you guys been critical of the show in the past? Are you currently critical, or do you love the show? I think, as I've already mentioned on this live stream, that there's a ton of times where we could get in like fights in the comments, right? Just reply and reply and reply and reply. And you get in arguments with people you don't even know just because you want to defend your thing. And maybe this show is your thing and you defended it. Or maybe you attacked, maybe you went on the offense on like one of the trailers or something and dropped some stuff and people came after you. And so you're like fighting with like 5 different people at once. If that's you, I'm curious to hear, like, have you watched much of the show? What do you think about the show? And be honest. I'm not going to fight with you in the comment section. But I am curious to hear what you have to say and what you think about this show. Anyways, I think that's about it. I did have another segment, but I think I'm going to save that segment for another time. Mostly just because I kind of want to. I kind of want to save it. And it's not pressing news either. So we'll see. It's not news. Other than that, I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me for 38 minutes. Really means a lot. I see a couple of you stayed in here the whole time. Really wish you guys would interact with me in the chat so I could get to know you, so I can know who you are. But I also respect your watching from a distance. But yeah, if you guys like watching this chat, give the video a thumbs up. Not watching the chat. If you like watching these streams, give the live stream a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate you hanging out. It means a lot. And that's about all I have to say about that. So I'll let you guys go. Thanks so much for joining. We'll see you next time.